Imagine a house at the edge of the Louisiana bayou, shrouded in fog so thick it seems to swallow the moonlight whole. The air hangs heavy with the smell of damp wood and decayed earth. Inside, a woman moves silently through corridors lined with locked doors and chained whispers. She is beautiful in a cold, calculated way, a widow cloaked in mourning, yet her eyes are voids, reflecting nothing but her own ambition. This was no ordinary grief. What you are about to hear is a story buried by time, intentionally erased, hidden behind polite society's false veneer of charity and refinement. They called her a benefactor, a woman who took in orphans, offered them warmth, education, and protection. But there was a price, and it was measured not in coin but in flesh, in terror, in the quiet destruction of innocence. In 1851, Louisiana was a place where law was often optional, and power answered only to itself. Amidst the sugarcane plantations and decaying antebellum estates, children disappeared quietly, their absences noted briefly, shrugged off by neighbors and authorities alike. They found their way to the widow's mansion, to her sanctuary of whispered screams. These children were chosen not for any crime, not for misbehavior, but for their malleability. They were human clay for experiments no ethical mind would endure, tests that would push the boundaries of medicine, morality, and human endurance. Her motivations were hidden beneath layers of social respectability. Letters she wrote, meticulously preserved by private collections, spoke of advancing knowledge for the greater good, a phrase that would become her justification for horrors that could make even the most hardened men recoil. She studied anatomy with an obsessive zeal, catalogued responses to fear, pain, and deprivation, and observed the fragile minds of children as if they were chess pieces in a game only she understood. Some say she spoke to the orphans as if they were already part of another world, a realm only she could access. Her voice was soft, persuasive, almost hypnotic, but it carried the weight of authority and inevitability. And the truth is, she was not a madwoman in the conventional sense. She was methodical, intelligent, patient, a predator disguised as a mentor, a murderer hidden behind a veil of civility. The mansion's shadows were not empty. They were alive with secrets, and one whisper could have condemned anyone who listened too closely. What you are about to see, hear, and understand will change how you perceive the limits of human cruelty, the manipulation of the innocent, and the lengths a mind bent on control will go to. Do not turn away. There is no comfort here, only revelation. And once you begin this descent, you will never emerge unchanged. The front doors of the mansion were wide, welcoming, if you knew nothing of what waited beyond. But once inside, the air shifted, dense and suffocating, carrying a subtle tang of chemicals and decay, a silent announcement that this was a place where ordinary morality did not apply. The widow's rooms were a labyrinth, corridors twisting like the inner workings of a mind obsessed with control. Each chamber had a purpose, a function, a method for bending reality to her will. Behind velvet curtains and polished floors, the children were observed, studied, catalogued, stripped of identity until they became subjects, not humans. The orphan boys and girls arrived from distant parishes, some claimed by families who had vanished into the flood of poverty and disease. Their names were forgotten before the ink on the paperwork dried. To the widow, they were not souls, they were experiments, raw data in her obsessive quest for understanding life, pain, and obedience. Some were forced to endure isolation, kept in small, dimly lit rooms for days until the mind itself began to fracture. Others were subjected to tests of endurance, made to face flames, cold, hunger, and fear as if she were conducting a symphony, each note a deliberate torment. The servants, fearful and complicit, spoke in hushed tones about the lessons she administered. They were terrified, yes, but they also understood a simple truth. To oppose her meant certain ruin, even death. And she was brilliant in maintaining this invisible grip. Letters, journals, and oral testimonies, some preserved in family archives, some buried in local folklore, reveal a woman who manipulated more than children. She manipulated perception, morality, the very instinct for justice in those around her. The widow was not satisfied with merely conducting experiments on flesh. She sought dominion over the mind itself. Visitors, rare and carefully screened, reported a house that seemed alive, almost sentient. They spoke of hallways that shifted in memory, of whispers that echoed long after the speaker had left. And the children, those who survived the initial weeks, often claimed to see her in places she could not possibly be. Some historians now believe she experimented with methods that were as much psychological as physical, training the mind to obey, to fear, to accept suffering as inevitability. By 1851, whispers of missing children had begun to surface, but nothing concrete could tether the widow to the horror she orchestrated. Letters from the time hint at the community's suspicion, yet fear kept tongues tied. People knew something was wrong, yet the mansion's reputation for philanthropy and refinement acted as a shield, a velvet trap that concealed monstrous truths. The widow thrived in the gaps of perception, in the spaces where society refused to look too closely. And it is in these gaps, these blind spots, that the darkest knowledge resides, waiting for the observer willing to see what others cannot, to understand what society dares not name. By the flickering candlelight, the widow's true experiments began, not with tools, nor with syringes, but with the minds of the children themselves. She understood something most could not see. Fear is a language, pain is a teacher, and obedience can be molded like soft clay. Each child was given a role, a test, a secret instruction, never fully explained. Some were told to whisper names in the night, others were made to repeat phrases, chants, or mantras that burrowed into their young minds, imprinting obedience and submission. She studied not just reactions, but adaptation. How quickly a child could unlearn trust, how easily hope could be extinguished. She experimented with isolation first. Days turned into nights, and nights into endless monotony. The children were made to sit in silent rooms, the walls painted in muted colors meant to dull the senses. Some were given mirrors, told to speak to their reflection as if it were another being, only to be corrected harshly if they faltered. She believed in creating dependence on herself alone. The mind, untethered from family, friends, or reality, became her instrument. She would test obedience by withholding food, affection, or light. The children who resisted, even slightly, faced punishments designed to fracture identity, bending them toward submission without breaking them entirely. It was a precision of cruelty few have ever witnessed. Her fascination with fear extended into ritual. She would gather her charges and instruct them to walk corridors blindfolded, hearing only her voice, learning to obey commands whispered in darkness. The sounds of chains, the soft cries of a sibling, the creak of floorboards, each carefully orchestrated, became part of a system of control. She documented it meticulously in journals hidden in locked drawers, writing as if she were conducting science, not perpetrating horror. The pages described patterns of panic, the physiological response to terror, and the subtle cracks that fear leaves in the psyche. Neighbors spoke of strange figures moving at odd hours, of children behaving as if possessed, repeating phrases no adult would teach. Rumors swirled, but the widow's reputation as a charitable, refined woman kept doubt at bay. Her influence reached beyond the mansion, into parishes, into the clergy, into anyone who might question her actions. She had mastered the art of hiding evil in plain sight. And for those who sensed something was wrong, the mansion itself became a metaphorical labyrinth. One could enter, but the truth was nearly impossible to escape without surrendering sanity or courage. The widow understood a terrifying principle. True power lies not in what people know, but in what they dare not see. Every child was a lesson, every scream a note in her symphony of control. And as the shadows deepened, the mansion's walls seemed to breathe, absorbing memory, fear, and obedience, becoming not just a house, but a living testament to human manipulation at its most sophisticated and most horrifying. As the months passed, the widow's experiments grew bolder, more intricate, more ruthless. She moved beyond isolation and obedience, into the realm of physical trials carefully designed to test limits, endurance, and the breaking point of the human spirit. Children were measured not just in height or weight, but in responses, the flash of fear in an eye, the tension of a small hand, the quiver of a voice under command. She catalogued each reaction, annotating journals with a clinical precision that made the horror all the more chilling. Pain was not random. It was a tool, a language, a key to unlocking the deepest recesses of human will. Food became a weapon, a morsel withheld, a plate offered then removed, a sweet treat promised only to be taken away. Each act was calibrated to sow confusion, to cultivate desperation, to teach reliance on her alone. She watched as children wrestled with hunger and longing, as they learned to suppress instinct, to obey, to anticipate her whims with a precision no adult could master. Even the smallest misstep was punished, sometimes with isolation, sometimes with sharp reprimand, other times with tasks that exhausted both body and mind. Her experiments were not limited to a single child at a time. She devised intricate group exercises where they were forced to observe one another, to record behaviors, to report lapses in courage or defiance. Fear became communal, contagious, a chain that linked them to her will and to each other's compliance. Rivalries, whispers, even loyalty to her. Everything was orchestrated to test limits of morality and instinct, to see how quickly a fragile psyche could bend to domination. And yet, she was seductive in her methods. Her charm, her elegance, her soft voice, even her feigned sorrow. These were all instruments of psychological mastery. A child who might otherwise scream or resist was often disarmed by her gentleness, by the illusion of care, before realizing that each gesture, each caress, each word, was a calculated step in her relentless manipulation. She was a master of contrast, terror and tenderness, punishment and reward, hope and despair, all wielded as tools to mold obedience, to crush rebellion, to remold identity. Even the most perceptive adults in the surrounding parishes were ensnared by her facade. They saw a widow of refinement, an advocate for the orphan, a woman who engaged in charitable works and hosted salons of polite society. None suspected that beneath the polished floors and crystal chandeliers, screams were catalogued, fear was measured, and innocence was deliberately dismantled. Her power was absolute because it was hidden in plain sight. And it is in this duality, the appearance of virtue masking the precision of cruelty, that the darkest lessons of her mansion reside. By the second year, the widow's experiments had evolved into something ritualistic, almost ceremonial. Every movement, every instruction, every punishment was choreographed with a precision that suggested a mind operating beyond human empathy. She began marking her children's progress with symbols, sketches, and coded journals, each page a testament to a sinister logic only she could comprehend. Some symbols were simple, an X for disobedience, a triangle for compliance. Others were more intricate, involving numbers, letters, and lines drawn in strange configurations, almost as if she were attempting to map the human psyche itself. The children were made to participate in these rituals, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes compelled to obey every instruction without understanding. They would stand in candlelit rooms, repeat phrases in unison, perform exercises that tested endurance, obedience, and fear thresholds. They learned quickly that any hesitation could bring a punishment so precise it would leave both mind and body trembling. The widow's brilliance lay in her ability to blend fear and fascination, making the children both terrified and entranced by her presence. Her mansion became a theater, and the children, her unwilling actors, performed in a drama of control, submission, and manipulation. Yet, there was more. Some of her experiments involved the observation of extreme reactions to mortality and decay. She would place objects of death, a bird, a small rodent, sometimes even remnants of corpses, before the children, observing their emotional, physical, and mental responses. She catalogued their reactions: tears, silence, trembling, defiance, compliance. Each response added another layer to her understanding of how fear could be internalized, processed, and ultimately controlled. She was building something unprecedented, a map of human obedience, a system for breaking down resistance and reshaping will. Outside, whispers of missing children began to reach the local clergy and authorities, yet each inquiry was deftly sidestepped. Her connections, her charm, her status in society acted as a shield. No one could pierce the veil she had drawn over her activities. Some children returned home temporarily, but those who survived were changed, marked by her influence in ways that terrified parents, neighbors, and even those who tried to intervene. She understood that fear could be inherited, that trauma could bind loyalty, and that secrecy could be as powerful a weapon as any chain or lash. Her control extended far beyond her mansion. Rumors tell of her sending letters under assumed names, coordinating with distant parishes to obtain new children, ensuring a constant supply of subjects. She had become a force that transcended legality, morality, and empathy, a figure who operated in the shadows of society while shaping life, mind, and death with unchallenged authority. And yet, this was only the beginning. The depth of her cruelty, the sophistication of her methods, and the totality of her control would only grow darker, deeper, more devastating for those trapped within her web. The widow's experiments began to extend beyond the mind, reaching into the fragile vessels of the children's bodies. She had learned that control over the flesh amplified control over the mind. She measured, restrained, and tested endurance with an almost scientific devotion. Limbs were manipulated, posture corrected with rigid devices, weights were introduced, and children were subjected to cold and heat in ways designed to teach compliance and the surrender of instinct. Every movement, every gesture was recorded in her journals, annotated with observations on pain, fear, and submission. Some children were made to endure long hours standing, sometimes in freezing water, sometimes in oppressive heat. She would enter the room silently, her presence alone a signal to obey or endure further punishment. Those who faltered, who dared to resist, were corrected swiftly but with precision. Her methods calculated to break defiance without killing, to mold their bodies into instruments of obedience. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of independence, a reshaping of physical will that mirrored her manipulation of the mind. Food and sleep became tools of control. Meals were given, then withdrawn. Sleep was denied to test alertness, obedience, and adaptability. Children learned to anticipate her expectations, to obey without hesitation, and to internalize the fear she instilled as a constant companion. The widow recorded these transformations meticulously, noting the correlation between physical duress and psychological malleability. Her journals suggest she believed the body could be trained to accept unimaginable circumstances, and through this training, the mind could be reshaped, sharpened, and ultimately dominated. Yet, the widow did not rely solely on pain. She mixed terror with illusion, comfort with cruelty. A child might be allowed a moment of affection, a whispered word of encouragement, a touch meant to soothe, only to be thrust back into suffering. This alternating pattern created an obsession, a dependency, a fear-laced loyalty that bound each child to her completely. They began to anticipate her control, to crave it, and to fear what would happen when it was absent. Her methods were horrifyingly effective, turning innocence into obedience, curiosity into terror, and trust into a tool of submission. What makes this horror even more insidious is that it was all cloaked in normalcy. To the outside world, she remained a widow of refinement, a caregiver to orphans, a pillar of society. No one suspected the intricate cruelty unfolding behind locked doors. No one saw the transformation of children into vessels of obedience. It was a deception perfected over years, a testament to her intelligence and ruthlessness. And as she expanded the reach of her experiments, as fear and control became inseparable, the mansion itself became a prison, a laboratory, and a temple of human domination. As the widow's experiments deepened, she turned her focus to morality, deception, and loyalty, the final frontiers of control. She sought not just obedience, but the complete reconstruction of the children's understanding of right and wrong. They were taught that trust was dangerous, that compassion was a weakness, and that survival depended entirely on submission to her will. In whispered lessons, she framed cruelty as knowledge, pain as enlightenment, and obedience as the only path to safety. Some children were forced to deceive one another, reporting imagined missteps, tattling on small transgressions, even inventing lies to demonstrate their loyalty. Through these exercises, she discovered how easily the human mind could be manipulated, how quickly morality could bend when survival, reward, or fear demanded it. Trust became a currency controlled entirely by her, and the bonds between the children themselves began to fracture, replaced by obedience, fear, and confusion. She introduced loyalty trials, rituals where children were instructed to choose between helping a peer or obeying her command. Those who acted independently were punished. Their suffering made a lesson for the others. Those who complied were rewarded, but never fully, always just enough to sustain hope and anticipation, always leaving them dangling between relief and terror. These trials trained the children to suppress instinct, deny empathy, and internalize fear as a guiding principle. At night, the mansion echoed with whispered instructions, chants, and the quiet sounds of compliance. The widow's presence was everywhere, felt even when unseen, a constant reminder of authority and control. She understood that power was not just physical dominance, but the mastery of perception. A child could never know when a command would come, or whether disobedience would be punished immediately, or days later. The uncertainty itself became a tool, embedding obedience deep into the psyche. Outsiders, of course, remained unaware. To them, The widow was a woman of dignity, a caregiver, a protector of society's most vulnerable. Her meticulous social engagements, charitable letters, and public benevolence masked the reality within her walls. Even servants, terrified though they were, could not fully comprehend the extent of her cruelty. She had created a microcosm of power, a system in which she was absolute, and every child, every action, every reaction fell under her scrutiny. And it is here, in this manipulation of trust, morality, and loyalty, that the true horror of her genius emerges. The widow did not merely punish or instruct, she rewrote reality itself for the children, teaching them to fear, obey, and revere her with equal measure. She had transformed them into instruments of control, yet the deeper lesson lies in what she left outside the mansion. A world blind to evil, incapable of seeing the subtle architecture of fear and power she had constructed. By now, the widow's work had entered a new, darker phase, a grotesque blending of medicine, anatomy, and psychological terror. She had access to texts few dared study, forbidden knowledge whispered about in closed circles of physicians and philosophers. Using these, she conducted experiments that tested the boundaries of life itself. Children were subjected to observations of circulation, sensation, and reaction, often under the guise of lessons in anatomy or physiology. Her notebooks detail measurements of pulse, respiration, and pain response with the meticulous precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a predator. She experimented with sensory deprivation and overstimulation. A child might be confined in a small, dark space for hours, days even, only to be suddenly exposed to blinding light, deafening sound, or cold water. The goal was not cruelty for its own sake, but mastery over how the mind responded to extreme stimuli. She documented the physiological reactions with obsession, pupils dilating, limbs trembling, hearts racing, minds bending. She sought patterns, correlations, and predictive models of obedience. How far could one bend the human will before it broke, and how could it be reshaped into perfect compliance? Her more invasive experiments included the study of injury and recovery. Small cuts, bruises, and burns were inflicted under strict observation to monitor pain response, healing, and psychological reaction. She was fascinated by endurance, resilience, and the threshold at which the body would no longer obey the mind. Some children were subjected to repeated trials, each more extreme than the last, building a hierarchy of obedience through suffering. It was as if she were constructing a template for absolute control, one that could be applied to anyone, anywhere, given time and strategy. What made her uniquely terrifying was a combination of intellect and subtlety. She could provoke terror without leaving obvious marks, teach lessons without raising suspicion, and orchestrate pain so precisely that it appeared accidental. To the outside world, she remained the charitable widow, while inside her mansion, she was a god of control, orchestrating fear, pain, and obedience with relentless calculation. Every scream, every cry, every act of submission became data, tools for refining her system, understanding the limits of human resilience, and shaping minds to her vision. And yet, even in this extremity, she maintained a facade of care. A soothing touch, a kind word, or a reward of food or attention would follow punishment or torment, teaching the children that obedience, even through suffering, could bring solace, but only from her. They learned that the line between comfort and terror was drawn by her alone, and that their existence, their pain, and even their fleeting hope were instruments she wielded with absolute authority. As the widow's mastery of mind and body grew, she turned to the most insidious of all experiments, the manipulation of identity itself. Names, memories, and even basic perceptions were slowly stripped from the children, replaced with what she dictated. A child who once remembered a family, a home, a simple joy, was taught to see those memories as distant, irrelevant, or dangerous. She forced them to answer only to the name she chose, to adopt behaviors and speech patterns designed to enforce obedience, to internalize her worldview as the only truth. She experimented with memory suppression and substitution, sometimes isolating a child for days with a single story, a single mantra, repeated endlessly until it replaced reality. Others were shown false narratives, told that friends and family had abandoned them, or that survival demanded total loyalty to her. Fear, affection, and repetition became tools for rewriting their sense of self. By the time she was finished, some children no longer knew who they were outside her mansion. They existed only as subjects, obedient instruments of her will. Her manipulation extended to perception. Light, sound, and even the smallest cues were controlled to teach the children that reality itself was fluid, that only she defined what was real. A whisper could become a command, a shadow, a warning. She orchestrated experiences that made the mind doubt itself, that made fear a constant companion. In these conditions, obedience became instinctual, reflexive, almost permanent. Resistance seemed impossible because reality itself had been rewritten to enforce compliance. Yet, she maintained the illusion of choice. Children were allowed to decide minor actions, only to realize later that every path led back to her control. This was not mere punishment. It was a carefully calculated method to teach submission while preserving the illusion of autonomy. Through repetition, fear, and guidance, she reshaped not just behavior, but identity itself, leaving behind humans who obeyed instinctively, who feared naturally, and who revered the source of both, her. Even outside observers, if any had glimpsed the mansion's inner workings, would have been unable to comprehend the extent of her power. The widow did not merely break spirits, she reconstructed them. Her victims became walking embodiments of her influence, models of fear and obedience honed to perfection. And it is in this rewriting of self, this deliberate erasure and replacement of identity, that the widow's true genius and horror reveals itself. She was no mere tormentor. She was an architect of the human mind, building a system of obedience, terror, and control that existed beyond morality, beyond society, beyond compassion. By now, the widow's experiments were no longer confined to the walls of her mansion. She began extending her influence outward, using the children themselves as instruments of power. Those who had been broken, reshaped, and reprogrammed became her messengers, her spies, her enforcers. Through subtle instructions and carefully crafted tasks, she tested not only obedience, but the capacity to manipulate, deceive, and exert control beyond her immediate presence. Fear, learned in isolation, became a tool in the wider world. Children were sent into the village under strict guidance, their behavior monitored with invisible strings. They were taught to mimic normalcy perfectly, to interact with others without suspicion, and yet to report back subtle details, rumors, tensions, vulnerabilities, any fragment that could reinforce the widow's control. They learned how to read adults' fears, to exploit weaknesses, and to wield obedience like a weapon. What she had created inside the mansion, a controlled, obedient psyche, now had reached into the world outside, expanding her influence without a single direct intervention. She experimented with social bonds and loyalty networks, observing how fear and reward could be transferred from one person to another. Children were given small tests: to betray a friend for favor, to mislead an authority figure, to convince others of lies she had planted. Each act was a microcosm of her larger system of control, and each success was meticulously documented. Through these exercises, she created a network of subtle manipulation, teaching that obedience and submission could extend beyond immediate fear to influence behavior at a distance. Her sophistication lay in the invisibility of her methods. To neighbors, parishioners, and local officials, the children seemed well-mannered, obedient, even grateful. None suspected the psychological chains beneath the polite smiles, the eyes that learned to hide terror behind calm, the precision with which every gesture and word had been drilled into compliance. She had created agents of influence, and the world itself became a laboratory, with fear and loyalty as her instruments. The widow's reach was now systemic. Every child, every interaction, every act of subtle influence expanded her power in ways the outside world could never detect. She had not merely created obedience within walls, she had woven it into the very fabric of perception, teaching control that transcended immediate fear, embedding manipulation as an invisible architecture of influence. And it is here, in the expansion of her system beyond the mansion, that the true magnitude of her genius and cruelty becomes undeniable. She had turned the innocent into vectors of control, ensuring her will extended far beyond her presence, shaping minds and behavior with silent precision. By this point, the widow's work had reached a level few could imagine. She no longer needed overt punishment to command obedience. She had internalized fear, control, and compliance within the children themselves. Her most advanced experiments were now psychological, exploring the nexus of mortality, terror, and submission. She created scenarios in which children believed life itself was contingent on her will. A whispered threat, a shadow passing too close, a suggestion of punishment. Each became a mechanism for teaching absolute control without a single lash. She introduced lessons in mortality disguised as routine instruction. Children were made to witness decay, rotting food, dead animals, and carefully staged injuries, to instill the inevitability of death and the necessity of vigilance. She catalogued reactions with obsessive precision: trembling, withdrawal, hypervigilance, or mechanical compliance. Each response added another layer to her map of human obedience, a blueprint for bending will and manipulating perception. In her journals, she described these as preparations for understanding the final law of existence, a terrifying statement from a mind so removed from empathy that it treated life itself as a tool. Yet she combined mortality with subtle rewards, creating a cycle of terror and relief that forged dependency. A child who endured a simulated threat without faltering might receive a morsel of comfort, a kind word, or a fleeting reassurance of safety, but always under her terms. She taught that survival depended on obedience, that comfort came only from compliance, and that deviation, even minor, could bring swift consequences. Fear and hope became inseparable, both wielded as instruments of domination. Her experiments now involved intricate simulations of choice under extreme conditions. A child might be told that their action could save a sibling, but the instructions were ambiguous, the consequences staged to provoke terror, guilt, and obedience simultaneously. She observed how they weighed morality against survival, how instinct clashed with indoctrination, and how quickly the mind could be molded when fear became the dominant driver of decision-making. By this time, her subjects were walking embodiments of terror and control, responding to cues almost instinctively, their minds reshaped into perfect instruments of obedience. What is most chilling is that these methods were not reckless. She was methodical, precise, calculating every reaction, every word, every nuance of human behavior. Her mansion had become a crucible for reshaping life, a place where innocence was dissected, fear weaponized, and obedience refined into art. Outside, society remained oblivious. The widow's genius and cruelty were invisible to the world, yet absolute in its impact on those she touched. She had become not just a master of fear, but an architect of the human soul. Even in the widow's meticulously controlled world, cracks began to appear, small, almost imperceptible, but significant. Fear and obedience can shape behavior, but they cannot entirely erase instinct, memory, or the spark of resistance that resides in every human soul. Some children, though terrified, began to question, to hesitate, to test boundaries. A glance exchanged in silence, a minor disobedience, a fleeting thought of escape. These small acts represented the faint pulse of rebellion, a reminder that even in a perfect system of control, imperfection lives. The widow noticed immediately. She catalogued these incidents with the same obsessive precision she applied to her experiments. A child's hesitation was not ignored. It became data. She tested responses with escalating intensity, creating exercises designed to suppress the emerging defiance while observing its mechanics. Some children were placed in scenarios where loyalty was pitted against instinct, morality against fear. She watched which strategies broke resistance, which cracks could be widened, and which could be repaired, refined, or repurposed to deepen submission. Yet, these small acts of rebellion revealed an uncomfortable truth. No system, however precise, is infallible. Minds and wills are not machines. They can surprise, resist, and even subvert control in ways the manipulator cannot fully predict. And in those moments, a child's instinct for survival, for freedom, or for moral reasoning flickered in defiance of her designs. Even a single whispered word of encouragement between two children, an unspoken alliance, could generate ripples across her tightly controlled environment. The widow adapted, evolving her methods in response. She increased surveillance, altered routines, and introduced exercises specifically designed to prevent alliance or mutual reinforcement. Her psychological systems became more complex, integrating observation, deception, and the anticipation of internal resistance. And yet, the mere existence of these small acts of defiance was a reminder that her dominion, though terrifyingly complete, was not absolute. It is here, in the interplay between absolute control and the faint pulse of resistance, that the story becomes more than horror. It becomes a study of power itself. She understood obedience, fear, and manipulation at levels few could comprehend, Yet she also faced the inevitable truth of human unpredictability. And for the children who dared, even briefly, to resist, these moments became acts of quiet courage, whispers of identity unbroken by terror, evidence that even in the shadow of total domination, the mind can find ways to survive. The widow's patience with defiance was a dangerous thing. She understood that even the smallest act of rebellion, if left unchecked, could unravel years of meticulously constructed obedience. When she noticed children whispering in corners, exchanging secret glances, or hesitating before obeying, she escalated her methods. Punishments became subtler, more psychological, designed to induce terror without leaving visible scars, lessons in fear disguised as guidance, obedience enforced through dread rather than force. She introduced exercises that tested loyalty under extreme conditions. A child might be told to act against another's interest, to choose between survival and compassion. The psychological calculus was brutal, empathy was punished, self-preservation rewarded, and the children quickly learned that morality was irrelevant, obedience was everything, and the cost of resistance could be devastating. Each failure was catalogued meticulously in her journals, every hesitation recorded as a data point, every emotional response dissected with clinical precision. Her strategies grew more elaborate. She created controlled scenarios where children believed they had options, only to discover that every choice led back to her desired outcome. Fear, hope, and obedience became intertwined, each reinforcing the other. The mansion itself was a tool in these exercises. Hallways twisted, rooms changed purpose, light and darkness manipulated to disorient and heighten anxiety. Even the architecture conspired with her, shaping perception, controlling behavior, and enforcing psychological submission. Yet, rebellion persisted. Small, clever acts emerged, secret signals, hidden messages, coordinated timing. Children found ways to test boundaries, to explore cracks in her system without immediately triggering punishment. And the widow, ever the observer, noted each incident. These small acts of defiance became the next level of her experimentation, forcing her to refine methods, increase scrutiny, and deepen her understanding of fear as a mechanism of control. It is here, in this relentless push and pull, that the widow's genius and horror converge. She was not simply cruel. She was adaptive, calculating, and relentless. Resistance was not merely punished. It was studied, measured, and incorporated into her system, making it more sophisticated, more unyielding. The children were trapped in a cycle of obedience, terror, and subtle resistance, a psychological web from which few could escape. And yet, for those who dared to defy, even briefly, the mansion remained a place of silent hope, a space where the human mind, however small, still remembered freedom and the possibility of choice. By the time the widow reached the peak of her control experiments, she began orchestrating scenarios that tested loyalty to the edge of human endurance. She forced children into impossible moral dilemmas: betray a friend to survive, lie to protect oneself, or commit acts they instinctively knew were wrong. Each choice was meticulously designed to measure the breaking point of morality under the weight of fear and obedience. She was no longer merely shaping behavior. She was reshaping conscience itself. These exercises were terrifyingly effective. The children quickly learned that instinct, empathy, and loyalty were liabilities. She recorded not only actions, but hesitation, guilt, and internal struggle, measuring how deeply fear could override natural moral instincts. The mansion became a laboratory of the soul, a place where innocence was dissected, reconstructed, and conditioned to obey without question. Even subtle signs of hesitation were met with calculated interventions: isolation, deprivation, or the threat of punishment for someone else to teach the interconnectedness of fear. She introduced a complex system of observation where children were both subjects and instruments. One would be tasked with monitoring another, reporting imagined or real missteps, creating a network of compliance enforced by peer surveillance. Fear now extended beyond direct authority. It became communal, internalized, and self-reinforcing. The children were taught to distrust not only the world, but each other, and ultimately themselves. Obedience became instinctual, loyalty was conditional, and resistance seemed impossible. And yet, even here, cracks appeared. Some children resisted in small ways, subtle gestures that evaded her notice for brief moments. A shared glance, a whispered warning, or a delay in execution became acts of defiance, silent yet profoundly meaningful. These glimpses of resilience reminded her, and the observer, of the stubbornness of human spirit. Her genius lay in the recognition that even these tiny rebellions could be used to refine her methods, to enhance her understanding of fear, control, and compliance. In these exercises, the widow perfected the architecture of dominance. She taught the children that morality was negotiable, that survival depended entirely on submission, and that every thought, word, and action could be weaponized against them. She had become not only a master of fear but an architect of the human psyche, capable of bending conscience itself to her will. And while the outside world remained oblivious, inside the mansion, life, death, morality, and loyalty were all instruments under her absolute command. By this stage, the widow's methods had evolved into a precise system of ritualized punishment and reward. Every act of obedience, every misstep, every whispered thought was accounted for, catalogued, and leveraged to reinforce her absolute authority. Punishments were no longer random. They were carefully timed, symbolic, and psychologically calibrated. A child might endure isolation until a heartbeat seemed like an eternity, only to be brought into light with a fleeting gesture of approval. The cycle of fear and relief became a mechanism of control more potent than any physical restraint. Rewards were just as calculated. A kind word, a morsel of food, or the smallest touch of affection was administered with surgical precision. They were never enough to satisfy, never guaranteed, always suspended as a promise to be earned through absolute obedience. The children learned quickly that every action, every thought, every hesitation could affect not just their survival, but their fleeting moments of comfort. Fear and desire became inseparable, intertwined in a system that taught the mind to submit instinctively, reflexively, permanently. The widow also developed complex rituals to reinforce loyalty. Daily routines, carefully choreographed exercises, and repetitive instruction created a rhythm that bound the children to her authority. These rituals were psychological anchors, ensuring that obedience became a habit, that fear and hope were eternally linked to her presence. She understood that repetition amplifies influence, that the mind craves patterns, and that habit could solidify control more effectively than overt cruelty. Even when a child attempted minor defiance, the system adapted instantly. Her observations were relentless. Hesitation was noted, whispered resistance corrected, alliances subtly disrupted. The mansion became a living organism, a structure of control that responded to every action with precision. Each child, each gesture, each response fed the widow's understanding, her experiments refining the architecture of obedience and fear. It is in this ritualized system that her genius and horror reached their apex. She had created not merely fear, but a psychological ecosystem, one in which obedience was not just demanded, but cultivated, internalized, and reinforced at every turn. Her victims became instruments of their own submission, performing behaviors designed to satisfy the unseen hand of authority. And though society remained blissfully unaware, within the mansion, life, fear, and survival existed only under her dominion, a carefully engineered world where power, terror, and control were inseparable, absolute, and unyielding. The widow's experiments now advanced into the most insidious territory, the manipulation of identity and memory itself. She understood that to control the body and behavior was insufficient. To achieve absolute dominance, she had to rewrite the mind, to erase what made each child an individual and replace it with obedience, fear, and dependence. Names, personal histories, and even the faintest recollections of home or family were systematically stripped away, leaving only the identity she permitted. She employed repetition, suggestion, and isolation to achieve this. A child would be forced to recount false events, repeating lies until the mind accepted them as truth. Memories of kindness, friendship, or comfort were reframed as dangerous illusions, while fear and submission were cast as the only reality. Over time, the children no longer knew who they were outside her system. They existed solely as extensions of her will. The mansion itself became a tool, a framework of cues and punishments that reinforced the erasure of self. She also studied the process of memory under duress. Children were subjected to extreme conditions, deprivation of sleep, irregular feeding, sensory overload, while being instructed to memorize sequences, chants, or behaviors. Their brains became conditioned to respond predictably under pressure. Fear was layered atop instruction, creating associations so deep that obedience became instinct. Even resistance carried consequences, and hesitation became an error to be corrected with precision. Subtle manipulations compounded her control. A fleeting gesture of encouragement, a whispered approval, or the promise of comfort was interwoven with pain or deprivation. Children learned that their existence, their comfort, and their fleeting sense of identity were contingent upon her approval. Her genius lay in the invisibility of this control. To outsiders, these children seemed compliant, even polite, while within, they had been reshaped to serve as instruments of faith, memory, and obedience. In the widow's journals, she described this process clinically, yet her writing betrayed a deeper obsession, the desire to understand, to quantify, and to master the human soul itself. Each erased memory, each substituted identity, each conditioned reflex brought her closer to creating the perfect system of control. And as the children's minds bent, reshaped, and submitted, the mansion became more than a building. It became a crucible of domination, a laboratory of terror, and a place where humanity itself was meticulously dissected, catalogued, and rebuilt under her absolute authority. By now, the widow's influence had transcended simple obedience. She began to manipulate perception itself. She understood that controlling what a child saw, heard, and believed was more powerful than any physical restraint. Light, shadow, sound, and timing became instruments in her experiments, tools to shape behavior and deepen submission. Hallways seemed longer, rooms darker, and footsteps echoed as though the house itself was alive, reinforcing the ever-present weight of her authority. She introduced symbolic rituals to reinforce obedience. A candle lit in a specific pattern, a repeated phrase, a touch on the shoulder. Each became a trigger for learned compliance. Children came to associate these signals with reward, punishment, or moral instruction. Fear and reverence became intertwined, and their reflexes bent to her will. Even in her absence, the mansion's cues guided them, the structure of the house, the layout of objects, the sounds of distant doors, all orchestrated to remind the children that power was omnipresent, unyielding, and absolute. Perception manipulation extended beyond the mansion. The children, now trained instruments of obedience, were sent into the surrounding community to observe, report, and subtly influence behavior. They learned to mimic innocence while gathering information, to project compliance while harboring knowledge of her control systems. Fear and loyalty became tools not only inside the mansion but throughout their interactions with the world, creating a network of subtle influence that she monitored and adjusted. Her system was recursive. Every act of observation, every misstep, every fleeting rebellion was noted, analyzed, and used to refine her methods. Children were taught to self-correct, internalizing obedience to a degree that it became instinctual. They learned to anticipate her expectations, to manage their fear, and to manipulate appearances, all under her guidance, all reinforcing her authority. In this stage, the widow was no longer merely a manipulator of children. She had become a master of perception, a conductor of behavior, and an architect of fear that extended into every facet of her environment. The mansion, the children, and even the surrounding community were all instruments in a larger symphony of control, one that blurred the line between reality and manipulation. Her experiments had become a system in which fear, obedience, and perception were inseparable, a total architecture of power that few could resist and fewer could even recognize. The widow's methods had matured into full-scale indoctrination. She understood that obedience is reinforced not only through fear and punishment but through repetition, social pressure, and the careful shaping of thought. Every interaction was designed to mold belief, every instruction a lesson in loyalty, every consequence a reminder of her absolute authority. The children were immersed in a controlled reality, a microcosm where fear and compliance were inseparable, and deviation was punished both openly and subtly. She used social dynamics to her advantage. Peer observation became a tool for reinforcing obedience. Children were made to watch one another, report missteps, and correct behavior. This created an internalized system of control. Fear of punishment was compounded by the knowledge that one's peers had become instruments of her will. Children learned to police not only themselves but each other, embedding obedience so deeply that it became instinctual, automatic, and nearly irreversible. Her indoctrination extended to language, ritual, and belief. Specific phrases, chants, and gestures were repeated until they were reflexive, reinforcing loyalty and submission. The children learned that every word carried weight, every action had consequence, and the widow's presence, whether physical or implied, governed every decision. In this way, obedience became not just behavior but identity, a core element of their being that could be triggered or adjusted at her discretion. The mansion itself was a participant in the indoctrination. Rooms were arranged to disorient, hallways to amplify anxiety, and cues, sounds, lights, scents, were orchestrated to elicit predictable responses. Every sensory input reinforced the hierarchy she had created. Power resided in her. Fear was the pathway to survival, and compliance was rewarded in subtle, calculated ways. Even the smallest hesitation was corrected with precision, shaping instinct, refining obedience, and consolidating her dominion. By now, the children's minds and behaviors had become extensions of her will. Their loyalty was no longer enforced through overt punishment alone. It had been internalized, conditioned, and ritualized. Fear, reverence, and anticipation of reward were fused, forming a psychological architecture of domination. The widow's experiments had moved beyond simple cruelty into a profound mastery of human behavior, creating instruments of obedience that were self-regulating, self-reinforcing, and terrifyingly effective. Her power was invisible, pervasive, and absolute, a testament to the dark genius of a mind that had studied humanity with obsessive precision. The widow's experiments had now entered the realm of symbolic control. She understood that abstract symbols, gestures, objects, colors, and phrases could evoke powerful psychological responses. Fear, obedience, and loyalty were no longer enforced only through direct instruction or punishment. They were encoded into every sensory and cognitive experience. A flicker of candlelight in a specific pattern, the placement of a chair, or the repetition of a phrase became triggers that activated learned obedience, reflexively shaping thought and behavior. She introduced layers of psychological imprinting. Every child became attuned to subtle cues, a shift in tone, a glance, the smallest movement signaling expectation or disapproval. Over time, these cues became internalized, shaping perception and decision-making even when she was not present. Children anticipated her command before they were given, their fear, loyalty, and obedience integrated into instinct. The mansion itself was a tool in this process. Walls, furniture, and lighting were strategically arranged to enhance disorientation, amplify anxiety, and reinforce the omnipresence of her authority. Symbolic rituals became central to her system. Children were required to repeat specific actions, phrases, or movements at precise times. These rituals were reinforced with subtle rewards or punishments, embedding obedience deep into habit, memory, and identity. Compliance was no longer merely expected. It became automatic, almost reflexive, an ingrained response to a meticulously constructed system of signs and triggers. Over time, the mansion transformed into a living matrix of control, with each sensory input serving as a vector of power. Even peer dynamics were harnessed symbolically. Children observing the rituals of others learned quickly what behavior was rewarded or punished. Competition, imitation, and the fear of standing out all reinforced conformity. Fear and reverence were transmitted socially, making the children agents of each other's control, further embedding her authority into the collective psyche. The mansion's walls, its shadows, its sounds, and its routines all became tools for encoding compliance, shaping not only action but thought itself. By this stage, the widow had perfected an invisible system of domination. Her experiments transcended physical or direct psychological control. They had become an architecture of fear, obedience, and identity, codified in symbols, behaviors, and perception. Her power was total, subtle, and enduring. To the outside world, she remained a refined widow, a charitable figure, entirely unremarkable. But within the mansion, she had created a laboratory of the human soul, where obedience was absolute, identity was malleable, and fear was a constant, shaping every thought, movement, and choice. By now, the widow had moved beyond individual manipulation into the orchestration of complex hierarchies among the children themselves. She understood that power could be amplified when subjects became instruments of control over each other. Certain children were subtly elevated, granted small privileges, or entrusted with responsibility, not as reward, but as a means of extending her influence. These appointed lieutenants enforced rules, monitored peers, and became conduits of fear and obedience, ensuring her will permeated every corner of the mansion. The hierarchy was carefully calibrated. Those elevated were rewarded subtly, their loyalty reinforced, but their power was conditional, always fragile, and entirely dependent on her. Those beneath them, every other child, were acutely aware of the consequences of failure or misstep. Peer enforcement intensified compliance. Fear became socialized, internalized, and reflexive, leaving children policing not only themselves but each other. Through these microstructures, obedience became a self-reinforcing ecosystem, resilient, pervasive, and almost invisible. She escalated psychological tests within this hierarchy. The lieutenants were tasked with administering punishments, instructing obedience, or delivering reports, all while under observation. Each action revealed how far fear and authority could be projected, how quickly obedience could be transferred from one mind to another. The children learned to anticipate manipulation, to exploit the hierarchy, and yet, ironically, to reinforce the widow's absolute control. Resistance was minimized, and every act of independence was either absorbed or neutralized within the system. Even subtle defiance, like delayed compliance or secret communication, was observed and converted into data. The widow constantly refined her strategies, making the hierarchy more efficient, more subtle, and more psychologically binding. The mansion became a living ecosystem, where every child's behavior, position, and reaction served her purposes. Obedience was no longer a simple response to fear. It was a structured, layered, and self-sustaining network of control. It is in these hierarchies that her genius, and her horror, reach a terrifying apex. Fear and obedience became systemic, flowing through layers of peer-enforced structure, reinforcing submission at every level. The children were both victims and enforcers, instruments and witnesses, each bound irrevocably to the widow's dominion. Outside, the world remained oblivious. Inside, she had engineered a microcosm of power, mastery, and terror so precise, so all-encompassing, that defiance was nearly impossible, and obedience was woven into the very fabric of identity, perception, and social structure. By this stage, the widow's work had become almost philosophical in its cruelty. She no longer sought mere obedience or fear. She sought to probe the boundaries of conscience, morality, and human will. Her experiments now intertwined ethical dilemmas with psychological control, forcing children to confront impossible choices, sacrificing loyalty to preserve self, denying compassion to ensure survival, obeying commands that violated instinctive moral understanding. Each decision was a window into the human psyche, each response meticulously recorded, analyzed, and used to refine her system. She framed these exercises as lessons in survival, teaching the children that morality was flexible, subjective, and subordinate to authority. Obedience became an ethical imperative, fear a moral guide. Instructed to weigh life, loyalty, and punishment, the children were made to internalize a worldview entirely dictated by her. Their natural sense of right and wrong was systematically eroded, replaced with the widow's construct. Survival depended on submission, deviation invited suffering, and fear was the ultimate arbiter of action. Her methods were subtle but pervasive. Children were exposed to scenarios where the consequences of their choices extended beyond themselves. An action could endanger a peer, or refusal could provoke punishment elsewhere. By manipulating the perceived moral stakes, she deepened psychological entanglement, embedding obedience into conscience itself. Every hesitation, every moral instinct, every flicker of resistance became a point of study, a vector to refine control, and a tool to ensure compliance. The mansion itself became a canvas for these moral experiments. Symbolic gestures, ritualized instructions, and environmental cues reinforced her framework. Shadows, sounds, and structured routines heightened anxiety, confusion, and awareness of consequence, making each decision heavier, more fraught. Children came to internalize not only fear but responsibility as defined by a system, linking obedience with morality, and terror with judgment. It was here, in the blending of morality and fear, that the widow's most insidious genius emerged. She had created a system in which obedience was ethical, defiance immoral, and fear itself a guide. Through these exercises, the children's minds were reshaped, their identities rewritten, and their moral compass bent toward absolute submission. She had transcended cruelty. She was now an architect of thought, fear, and conscience, mastering not only behavior but the very framework through which his subjects understood right, wrong, and survival. At this point, the widow's control had become ceremonial, ritualized to the degree that fear, obedience, and identity were inseparable from the mansion itself. Every action, every glance, every gesture was orchestrated into a rhythm of domination. Meals, lessons, punishments, and rewards followed strict patterns, designed not only to maintain control but to create a sense of inevitability. Obedience became ritual, ritual became identity, and identity became inseparable from her authority. Children were trained to respond to precise signals, a candle flicker, a whispered command, the placement of objects. Each cue evoked a predictable reaction, reinforcing her control through repetition, anticipation, and ritualized fear. Compliance was no longer a conscious choice. It had become instinct, embedded through constant reinforcement into every thought, movement, and perception. Even minor deviations were corrected, subtly, immediately, embedding lessons deep into the psyche. The widow's rituals extended beyond individual children. She orchestrated group exercises in which peer enforcement was central. Children monitored one another, reported missteps, and participated in the reinforcement of fear and loyalty. The hierarchy she had established became integral to these ceremonies, ensuring that obedience flowed not only from her presence but through the network she had created. Each child became a participant in their own submission, an enforcer of the system, and a witness to the power she wielded. Ritualized punishment and reward further bound behavior to her authority. A whispered word of approval, a symbolic touch, or the timing of relief after torment became tools to solidify obedience. The children learned to anticipate, to fear, and to revere her influence, internalizing the rhythm of control so deeply that it shaped their identity and perception. The mansion itself seemed alive with her power. Each room, corridor, and shadow a vector for reinforcement, a silent reminder of her omnipresence. Through these ceremonial structures, the widow had perfected the architecture of domination. Fear, loyalty, and identity were no longer separate. They were fused into a single system, maintained through ritual, hierarchy, and symbolic control. The children's minds, once independent, were now instruments of obedience, reshaped by repetition, anticipation, and terror. The mansion was no longer merely a house. It was a crucible of fear, a temple of submission, and a laboratory in which the human soul itself was studied, dissected, and remade to serve her will. With rituals established and obedience internalized, the widow escalated her experiments into the realm of direct moral corruption. She sought to understand not only fear and submission but the limits of conscience itself. Children were compelled to act in ways that violated instinct, empathy, and decency. Small transgressions at first, escalating to increasingly severe acts. Each act was calculated, measured, and documented, a precise probe into the capacity for obedience to override morality. Some exercises forced children to betray one another, to conceal truth, or to participate in acts they instinctively recognized as wrong. The widow observed every hesitation, every flicker of guilt, every internal struggle, seeing in them patterns of compliance, resistance, and adaptation. Each act of moral compromise strengthened the network of control. Obedience became inseparable from the erosion of conscience, and guilt was reframed as a mechanism for reinforcing loyalty. Psychological conditioning intensified. The widow blended fear, reward, and moral ambiguity so seamlessly that the children's perception of right and wrong became dependent entirely on her guidance. Rewards were given for compliance with ethically troubling tasks, punishment for hesitation or disobedience, and approval was always conditional. Over time, the children internalized a moral framework. Obedience was not just survival, it was virtue, and resistance was vice. Isolation and observation were refined to magnify psychological impact. Children were sometimes separated, forced to reflect on their actions under guided suggestion, or made to anticipate punishment for perceived moral failings. The mansion's architecture, shadows, and sounds amplified these exercises, ensuring that guilt, fear, and obedience became inseparable. Every corridor, every door, every echo became a tool for reinforcing compliance and reshaping conscience. Through this systematic corruption, the widow achieved terrifying mastery. She had created a framework in which moral intuition was subverted, in which fear dictated action, and in which obedience was fused with internalized guilt. Children were no longer simply obedient, they had become instruments of her ethical architecture, responding automatically to her influence, policing their own behavior, and participating in the perpetuation of her control. Outside, the world remained blind. Inside, the mansion had become a laboratory of moral domination, a crucible in which the human spirit was bent, tested, and remade in the image of her will. The widow's experiments now ventured into extreme psychological stress, where memory, loyalty, and identity were tested simultaneously. She designed scenarios that forced the children to question what was real, whom they could trust, and even who they were. By manipulating memory through suggestion, repetition, and deception, she ensured that past experiences were unreliable, leaving the children dependent on her guidance for interpretation, survival, and understanding. She orchestrated challenges in which children had to choose between competing loyalties, sometimes to a peer, sometimes to herself, sometimes to an abstract principle she invented. Every choice carried psychological consequences. Hesitation could bring punishment, action could bring guilt, and compliance could produce fleeting relief. The mansion became a stage for these exercises, each room and corridor amplifying tension, disorientation, and uncertainty. Over time, the children learned that certainty, morality, and self-knowledge existed only at her discretion. Memory manipulation was central. She made children recall false events, erase past attachments, and reinterpret prior actions to conform with her expectations. A fleeting memory of home or kindness was reframed as danger or betrayal. A moment of instinctive resistance was cast as foolish or sinful. Through these interventions, the children's identities were gradually overwritten, leaving only a version of self that existed in service to her control system. The widow's observation was relentless. Every emotional response, fear, guilt, pride, shame, was catalogued and analyzed. Small deviations were corrected with precision, subtle cues were reinforced with repetition, and fear became a tool to solidify memory and loyalty. She understood that the human mind craves stability, and by controlling memory and perception, she became the sole arbiter of what was true, safe, or acceptable. By the end of these exercises, the children's sense of self, loyalty, and memory was inseparably tied to the widow. Obedience was no longer external. It was embedded in cognition, emotion, and identity. They had become instruments of her will, responding instinctively to cues, internalizing fear, and perpetuating her system without conscious thought. The mansion, once a building, had become a living, breathing laboratory of total psychological dominance, a place where memory, loyalty, and identity were not personal but entirely contingent upon her authority. By this stage, the widow's experiments had coalesced into a system of near-total domination. Fear, loyalty, and obedience were no longer separate. They were fused into a single, unbreakable framework that controlled thought, perception, and action. She had learned how to trigger instinctive compliance, manipulate memory, and restructure morality, creating minds that responded automatically to her presence, her signals, and even the suggestion of her authority. Every interaction reinforced the hierarchy she had constructed. Children anticipated commands before they were given, corrected each other's missteps, and internalized punishment and reward so deeply that obedience had become reflexive. Fear was no longer just a response. It had become a guiding principle. Loyalty was no longer voluntary. It had become instinct. Identity itself was tethered to submission, making resistance not only dangerous but psychologically nearly impossible. She refined environmental cues to amplify her dominance. Shadows, sounds, lighting, and architectural patterns were orchestrated to maintain tension, anticipation, and reverence. A flick of a candle, a whisper down a hallway, or a subtle shift in posture became triggers for reflexive obedience. Even brief absences of the widow were filled with learned expectation. The children themselves maintained the architecture of fear, enforcing her rules, reminding each other of consequences, and perpetuating her control. Her mastery of social psychology was as precise as her control over perception. Peer hierarchies, observational reporting, and subtle manipulation of guilt and pride ensured that compliance was both self-reinforced and socially enforced. The children had become instruments of the system she had built, agents of her dominion, each internalizing fear, obedience, and identity as inseparable components of survival. By now, The widow had created a near-perfect laboratory of psychological domination. Minds were molded, morality was subverted, and obedience had become reflexive. The mansion was no longer simply a structure. It was a living instrument of control, a crucible of fear, identity, and loyalty. Outside, society remained unaware. Inside, total domination had been achieved, a testament to her terrifying genius. And yet, even in this near-complete system, the human mind harbors flickers of resistance, faint sparks that the widow studied, catalogued, and sought to extinguish, or bend further into her design. Even within the widow's meticulously controlled system, faint sparks of resistance began to appear. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, a hesitation before compliance, a glance shared in silence, a fleeting act of defiance. To most observers, these moments would have seemed inconsequential, but to the widow, they were data points, evidence that even the most perfectly conditioned mind could harbor instinctual resistance. She responded with precision. These small acts were neither ignored nor punished arbitrarily. They became opportunities for further refinement of her methods. She increased observation, manipulated social dynamics, and introduced new exercises designed to break the flicker of defiance while simultaneously learning how resistance emerged, how it spread, and how it could be anticipated. Every hesitation became a case study in human resilience under fear. Every minor rebellion a test of her system's adaptability. The children's interactions became microcosms of psychological warfare. Peer hierarchies were leveraged to detect subtle signals, alliances were disrupted before they could solidify, and loyalty was constantly tested against instinct. Even internalized fear became a tool. The children began policing themselves, suppressing impulses they once might have acted upon. Resistance persisted, but it was now contained, observed, and redirected, feeding into the widow's understanding of obedience as a self-reinforcing mechanism. She introduced deliberate moral tension to gauge compliance under pressure. Children were placed in situations where instinctive empathy conflicted with learned obedience, forced to choose between immediate survival, peer standing, or hypothetical consequences. Every choice, hesitation, and rationalization was noted, analyzed, and used to enhance the architecture of fear and compliance. These subtle rebellions became a proving ground for her mastery over the human mind, teaching her where cracks existed, and how far control could extend before resistance emerged. Even in this controlled ecosystem, the human spirit flickered. The widow's genius lay in her ability to detect it, measure it, and integrate it into her system, refining fear, loyalty, and obedience with every minor act of defiance. Resistance no longer existed as a threat to her dominion. It became a tool for perfecting it. And in that terrifyingly precise system, the children's minds, morality, and identity were sculpted with relentless control, leaving only obedience, fear, and subtle sparks of rebellion that served her designs rather than undermined them. The widow's experiments had now reached a level of anticipatory control that bordered on the preternatural. She no longer merely reacted to behavior. She shaped it before it occurred. By observing patterns, micro-expressions, and subtle cues, she predicted hesitation, defiance, or disobedience before it manifested. Every thought, every impulse, every instinct became a potential point of influence, and she wielded this knowledge with ruthless precision. Children were trained to anticipate consequences as though they existed even before actions were taken. Fear was internalized so completely that hesitation itself became painful. Obedience was no longer a response to commands. It was preemptive. Even in the absence of direct instruction, the children acted in alignment with her will, their minds conditioned to expect, interpret, and comply with signals that often existed only in their imagination. The mansion itself, its shadows, echoes, and architectural cues, reinforced this anticipatory conditioning. She also intensified symbolic triggers. Specific phrases, movements, and environmental patterns became predictive tools. A candle's flicker, a whispered word, or the subtle alignment of objects signaled approval or threat. The children internalized these signals to the point that they began to police themselves, correcting their thoughts, behaviors, and impulses in advance. Their identity became a reflexive instrument of obedience, their fear preemptive, their loyalty automatic. Even moral instinct was reshaped. The widow engineered situations in which ethical decisions were anticipated and evaluated before action. Children learned that deviation, hesitation, or independent reasoning could provoke consequences even if enacted upon. Obedience became thought, perception, and anticipation merged into a single, unbreakable system. Resistance was no longer a possibility. It was neutralized in the formation of intention itself. In this stage, the widow had achieved what few could imagine: control over thought before behavior, fear before hesitation, loyalty before command. The mansion was no longer a laboratory. It was a mind-forging engine, a crucible in which anticipation, obedience, and identity were inseparably fused under her authority. Outside, society remained blind. Inside, she had created instruments of absolute dominance, capable of responding to her will even before it was expressed, their every impulse and thought aligned to her design. By this stage, the widow had moved beyond controlling behavior or thought. She was reshaping identity itself. Through symbolic rituals, repeated cues, and psychologically engineered routines, she instilled a system in which loyalty, fear, and obedience were inseparable from the child's sense of self. Every action, every decision, every fleeting thought was tied to her authority, encoded as an internalized signal of survival and belonging. Symbolic identity shifts became central to her method. Children were required to adopt specific postures, gestures, and phrases, each linked to compliance and approval. Over time, these symbols became inseparable from self-perception. The child who hesitated or deviated felt an internalized sense of wrongness, guilt, or even danger. Fear and identity were fused, creating a psychological chain that made disobedience almost impossible, not because of external enforcement, but because the child had internalized her dominance as part of who they were. Psychological loyalty was reinforced through layered reward and subtle social reinforcement. Frightened children were elevated, assigned minor authority, or entrusted with tasks that reinforced the system. Peer enforcement became automatic. Children corrected each other, subtly perpetuating the widow's power without her intervention. Loyalty was no longer externally imposed. It was socially and psychologically reinforced, embedded into perception, action, and self-image. The mansion itself was integral to this conditioning. Its shadows, sounds, layout, and rituals all served as vectors of identity shaping. Even absence from her direct observation was not freedom. The environment, cues, and internalized training ensured that the